So on the next page, it jumps over to 5.8. We're not going to talk about maximums and minimums. Those are actually like the top of the graph and the bottom of the graph. But we're not going to talk about those because those actually aren't in our SOLs. So you can take your writing utensil and you can cross out, we're not going to do maximums plus. Okay, you can cross this one out too. We're not going to do minimums. And I know that that's a huge section of the page, but I did want to use the bottom part of this page. So when you look down at the next part of the page, okay, this is what we have talked about. It's reading, it looks a little bit different. And that is zeros and solutions and x-intercepts. They are all the same. So these are all talking about the same thing. Okay, and that is where we cross the x-axis. That's those x-intercepts. X-intercepts of a graph. Okay, so these three things, if you see any of those words, they all mean the same thing. All right, so let's see. Your textbook uses the variable k. We use k for a lot of things. I think I want to use h instead. So make that h instead. So that means that h is a 0, h is a 0, is a solution, and h is an intercept, okay? So if you're crossing the x-axis, that number, whatever h stands for, whether it's 5 or 10, or even if it's -5, okay? It means the same thing in all three of those cases. You could hear any of those questions, and they all mean the same thing, okay? Factor is where it changes. Factor is where we have the opposite. So you want to make sure that factor, you realize, is the opposite, so it's x minus h. Not only do you throw an x in there, but you also do the opposite. So if this is positive, you make this minus. If this is negative, you actually make that plus, okay? So this one is the opposite. It is different than the others, okay? All of these other words mean the exact same thing. You look at the same place on your graph, okay? So then here, that means that the point you would get is just h0. Okay? So the whole point is that these are the same thing. It's where you cross the x-axis. The factors are the opposite, and you make a binomial out of those factors, all right? So let's look at what that looks like on our example. All right, so for example 1, we're going to go the opposite direction now. And we are going to say, okay, well, since this is a factor, okay, that means that the solutions, or the x-intercepts, are the opposite of those. So let's think of it this way. Let me see how much room I have. Okay. All right, so if my factors, let's think of it this way. Factors and x-intercepts. So if my factors are x plus 1, and there's 2 of them, because it's squared right there, so that stands for 2 factors, and then x minus 4. Okay? Well, factors and x-intercepts are opposites. So if the factor is x plus 1, that means the intercept is x equals -1. Okay? If my factor is x plus 1, this one's also equal to -1. And if this one's minus 4, that means the intercept, or the 0, or the solution, all the same thing, is a positive 4. Okay, so this just means this is where we want to put it on our x-axis, at -1, and at positive 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? So that's where our graph is crossing the x-axis. Okay? So think of it that way. Here's the factor, there's the intercept. Here's the factor, there's the intercept. So use the intercepts because -1 and 4 are zeros, same thing as x-intercepts, of f. So we plot -1, 0 and 4, 0. Even though there's two of these, -1 is the same thing for both of them. And what that means is when we draw our graph, instead of coming up, out, and hitting twice, this 2 stands for actually 2 answers. So the graph looks something like this. Because it's positive, that means it goes up on the right. Then we bring it down, it hits there, but then it bounces back down. This part right here counts, instead of coming up and back down, because of this little 2, it actually just brushes it. And we're going to talk more about that. We're going to practice more about that. But that's kind of in general what it looks like. I'm not worried about these. I really just want you guys to get used to converting factors and intercepts, or factors and solutions and so forth, okay? So I'm not too worried about getting these other points. So don't worry about that. Just kind of generally draw it and understand that when you get factors, you know what the x-intercepts are, okay? So let's look at the bottom of that. And then I think we're pretty good. So, let me move it. Oh, let me also tell you, okay, we're not going to do this part either. We will eventually talk about this. But really right now, I'm just trying to relate factors and intercepts and factors and solutions, since that's what we're working on. So end behavior we will get to, but we're going to talk about that next unit. Okay, so don't worry about, let me see if there's anything in here. Yeah, don't worry about this. We haven't talked about this yet. We might use the exact same notes and talk about it next unit, but don't worry about that. And then we've already drawn the graph, so we're good with that. Okay? All right, so this last one. Okay? Again, let's make the table. And we have the factors on one side. So that will give us the x-intercepts, or the solutions, on the other side. Okay, so if the factors are, let me move that, x minus 2, x plus 1, and x minus 1. Okay, if those are our factors, then the solutions are the opposite. It's a -2, this is a -1, and this is a +1. So there's 3 factors, so there's 3 solutions. That's typically what happens. When we've got 3 factors, we should have 3 solutions. Excuse me, that should be a +2. All right, so +2, -1, +1. All right, so +2, -1, and +1. Okay, again, this is a positive number. This number at the very, very front, since it's positive, that means it goes up. Okay, just that's our pattern with some of these rules. It goes up at the end. So since this goes up, okay, that means that it's got to come down and back up in order to go through this one, which means it's got to come back down to go through that one. Okay, so all we're doing to get these graphs is we know it's positive, so it goes up at the end, and then we just go backwards from it. It must come back up to go through that one. We don't know where it's peaking right there. We don't know, because we haven't talked about that. On the graph that I have, it actually goes up pretty high, if that matters. But we're actually gonna go backwards too, and we're gonna use graphs in order to decide on these answers, okay? So this is the big part, factors and solutions, or factors and intercepts. So you can actually look at graphs and you can get solutions from them, or you can be given factors and you can kind of estimate what the graphs would look like. Okay, so let's just finish out this and then we're good. Alright, so So the very end says, the graph of every polynomial function of degree n has at most blank turning points. Okay? All right, so degree n means the highest power. So if the highest power is a 3, that's the degree. If the highest power is a 4, that's a 4. So it says that turning points, it actually has one less. So we say n minus 1. So it's one less than that. And we'll talk more about that. We'll practice more on that. Okay? Moreover, if a polynomial function has n distinct real zeros, then its graph has exactly one less turning points. Okay? So and real zeros just means it actually crosses the axis. So if it crosses the axis, then that means that the turning points is one lower, and there's exactly that many. And we'll talk about what that means, like in class, like what the highest exponent means, and that the turning points kind of go the opposite of that. Okay, so that should get us started at least with factors and solutions, and relating them so that you don't always have to factor and you don't always have to solve. You can use your calculator to get you some of these answers. Okay, there's some connection between what the graph looks like and what the polynomials and how they factor and stuff. Okay.